This is Christmas Car Kerfuffle, Episode 2. Written by Jessie Gussman. Performed by J. Dice. I was just thinking upstairs that it might be a good opportunity today to have your Gram go with Grandpap and me to New York. I promise I'll take care of her, he added quickly when her face scrunched up.
I know you will, she assured him immediately. I just hate to put you out even more than you already are.
It's not a huge deal. Grandpap is already going with me. He doesn't really have a choice unless he wants to sit here by himself all evening.
He could come to my house, she heard herself say. But hey, why not? It wasn't like she had plans. Not anymore.
Would that be better than me taking them with me? He asked, his voice low, his green eyes searching her face. She looked away, suddenly uncomfortable with their closeness and her reactions to him. He'd been a great uncle and a good friend. If she started getting weird on him, she could lose it all.
It's up to you. You might end up stopping a lot with two older people in the car.
I don't mind. It's not like there's a race to get back. What a difference from Ken, who saw everything as a race or a competition. She opened her mouth to say that was fine, but snapped it closed with his next words. You could go too. Her mouth dropped. He shifted his feet and a flush crept up his neck. I mean, I'm sure you have better things to do this close to Christmas, and I've already put you out enough with losing your car to begin with.
I appreciate you taking responsibility for it, but we both know it wasn't your fault.
He just asked her to go to New York with him? She hadn't misheard? She could hardly believe it, and frantically searched her brain to try to figure out if he were just trying to keep her from being alone this evening, since he already knew her mother had her kids. Or did he really want her? He shoved his hands in his pockets. It's my business. I can't always control what my employees do, but I have to shoulder the blame. If he'd forgotten to put the oil cap back on and your car had blown up 50 miles down the road, that would be my baby too.
Not everyone thinks that way.
He shrugged like it wasn't any big deal. Maybe he regretted his offer since he didn't repeat it. The silence stretched between them. He put his hand on the door, ready to walk out. Well, maybe she won't be interested. Let's go see what they say. She nodded and they walked back out, her chest swirling with disappointment. Zayden could have kicked himself for his offer to take Blythe with him. Why in the world would she want to take a worthless trip to New York to fix the mix-up her mechanic/brother-in-law had made? He loved spending time with Rand and Lottie, and loved that seeing his niece and nephew also meant he got to see Blythe. But she obviously didn't have the same feelings for him that he had for her, and if he wanted to keep their relationship from being awkward, he needed to keep his mouth from running off when it should really stay shut. Like just now. Halfway through his formal dining room, he could see Grandpap and Gram on the couch together. They were situated in the middle of it, rather than on each end the way they were when he'd walked out. Their heads leaned together, and they seemed like they were in deep conversation about something. He glanced at Blythe and nodded to the old couple. She grinned and gave him a cheesy thumbs up. He stumbled, the ache in his chest sharper than it ever had been before. Her beautiful smile pulling his own lips up, even while his heart hurt. Jerking his gaze away, he cleared his throat. Hey, I'm ready. He came around the front of the couch and hunched down in front of Gram. I was wondering if you want to go with Grandpap and I?
Funny you should mention that, son.
She slanted a look at Grandpap out of the corner of her glasses.
I was just thinking that I'd love to go, but I wanted to spend some time with Blythe, too. So, She turned and watched as Blythe walked around and stood beside Zayden.
I figured I'd ask Blythe if she wanted to ride along to New York and back.
The four of us could go together,
Grandpap added, just in case Zayden didn't get it the first time, apparently. The sly looks the older couple were sending to each other raised his radar, but he couldn't figure out their code speak. He looked at Blythe. I already asked her if she wanted to come, but I think she forgot to answer. He wanted to give her an out in case she really didn't want to. This is a busy time of year. She probably has a ton of things to do.
She was going to wrap gifts tonight, with me, Graham insisted. That's impossible, so that means she's free.
Zayden stood. He was about to open his mouth to help Blythe back out gracefully when her next sentence shot that idea to pieces. I'd actually love to go. What a great idea. A Christmas road trip with grandparents.
Everything happens for a reason, even this Christmas car kerfuffle.
Pap used his cane and eased himself up.
I need to stop at the little boy's room, then I'll be ready.
Show me where it is, because I need to use it too,
Graham said as Blythe helped her to her feet. They toddled off together to the hall bathroom. Do you mind still stopping at my house? I'd like to change into something more suited to a road trip than this. Blythe indicated her outfit, a business skirt suit and heels. And I'd like to grab something to munch on. Of course I'll stop. And don't worry about food. We'll stop somewhere and grab a bite. Zayden could hardly believe he was going to get to spend the next 8 hours with Blythe. He just had to maneuver the seating arrangements. He checked the doorway where the older couple had disappeared. You think we can manage to get them in the back seat together? She grinned. You handle Grandpap, and I'll get Graham. We just won't give them a choice. Turned out it was needless worrying, since both Graham and Grandpap expressed a desire to ride in the back seat. Which was a little odd, because Zayden had never heard Grandpap say that he got a little dizzy riding in the front, and when Graham had claimed that the front seat made her hip replacement hurt, Blythe's face had registered surprise like she hadn't known. They stopped for a few short minutes at Blythe's house. She ran in looking like a successful businesswoman. She came back out looking better than Christmas cookies with icing. Soft, worn blue jeans, boots, and a light green sweater gave her a casual look that made it hard for him to take his eyes off her. She carried a coat in her purse. He swallowed as she got back in and tried to act like she wasn't the most beautiful woman in the world. They were out on the highway, taking I-99 to I-80, when Blythe suggested Christmas carols. If you can stand my braying, I've never been much of a singer. He loved singing, but he usually confined it to the shower and church.
That's okay. My sister always said I couldn't carry a tune in a bucket,
Grandpap said from the back seat.
I guess you take after me.
Blythe got the music up on her phone, which was already synced to the car radio, and Rockin' Around the Christmas Tree came out in full stereo. Graham and Grandpap had no problems getting into the music from the back seat. I think they'd be dancing right now if we were home, Zayden said, his fingers tapping on the wheel. I know they would be. Blythe's eyes twinkled. I'd be wanting to, too. He could live with that. He'd never been a big fan of dancing, always more comfortable with a tool of some kind in his hand, but heck yeah, he'd dance if it meant holding Blythe. I'll hold you to that when we stop to eat. No one dances at restaurants anymore. We can't let Graham and Grandpap be the only ones. Gotta take one for the team. He slanted his gaze over at her. The humorous gleam in her eye and the upturn of her lips said she could get into the matchmaking holiday spirit. The chorus came on and he sang along. If he had a chance to be more than friends with Blythe,
His lack of any type of singing ability was not going to make a difference. They laughed as their wrong notes struck discordantly with the music pumping through the car stereo. And as the next few songs came on, the four voices in the car almost drowned it out completely. White Christmas came on, slower, in a deep baritone, and Blythe's laughter faded. She grew quiet. "Don't know this one?" Zayden asked, checking the back seat where Graham hummed along and Grandpap softly sang.
We used to watch this movie every year. It was a tradition, I guess. Just makes me nostalgic.
By we, he figured she meant Ken and her, and the happy bubble in his chest burst. Obviously, despite the divorce and the years that had passed, she still had feelings for his brother.
I'd skip it, but it is one of Graham's favorites.
She bit her lip and looked away, but not before he saw the one little tear in her eye. "Hey." He touched the back of her hand where it lay on her lap with the tips of his fingers, meaning to give her a soft stroke of comfort. His fingers tingled and his heart shook as her body froze, and her gaze snapped to his. Her eyes were big. He could almost see the question marks in them, but she didn't move her hand away. He looked back at the highway. "Just wanted to say it's okay to miss the things we used to have." She looked down at their hands, his work-worn and rough, big, hers smooth with delicate blue veins under her translucent skin, soft. Her throat moved.
When Ken left, there was a big hole in our lives.
She sighed deeply.
I know you've tried your best to fill it.
He felt like she was telling him he could never take Ken's place. His heart thumped painfully, and his jaw clenched. But her hand twisted under his, and just as he was getting ready to pull his hand away, her fingers intertwined with his.
"Thank you,"
she whispered. White Christmas ended, and the car was once again filled with Christmas singing. He was going around a sweeping curve just before their exit when brake lights, lots of them, came into view. He hit his own brakes, hard. Traffic came to a standstill, and the festive atmosphere in the car seemed to still along with it.
Is it an accident?
Graham asked from the back. I can't tell, Zayden said, watching his rearview mirror closely. Not that there was anywhere to go if the 18-wheeler behind them didn't get hoed down in time. It stopped, thankfully, and Zayden relaxed a little. Blythe's hand still held on to his. He wasn't sure, exactly, what that meant, especially after the statement that she'd uttered before she took it. But he supposed, like a beggar, he'd take what he could get, and tried not to question it too closely. Blythe relished the feel of the strong hand holding her own. Ken's hands had been soft. It didn't take a lot of strength to be a good doctor, and he was a good doctor who cared about his patients and truly tried to do the best he could for them. She couldn't fault him there. Too bad he hadn't wanted to do that with his family. Would Zayden be the same? Suddenly an idea came to her, and she didn't think about it too much before she turned in her seat and said,
"Tell me a funny story about Zayden, Grandpap."
"Whoa," Zayden said. "That is not the slightest bit fair. There are 4 of us in this car, and I'm the one that gets picked on?"
Just relax, son. I'll give you a good one about Blythe when we're done.
I have just the story, Grandpap said, and Blythe realized he didn't have a clue that she just wanted to learn more about Zayden. He was actually going to enjoy talking about his grandson. Zayden had a pet rat when he was a teenager. No, not the rat story. Zayden put his forehead on the steering wheel.
Good thing we're stopped,
Blythe said under her breath. I wouldn't do this while I was driving, but trust me, you do not want to hear this story."
"Stop being so dramatic," Grandpap said. "There's really not much to it. He had this white rat, and he took it out of its cage, and it got loose in the house."
Ugh, that's awful.
Blythe shivered. "That's exactly what my mom thought. Honestly, I don't have rats anymore." Zayden lifted a brow at her as she squeezed his hand to let him know that she didn't hold it against him.
"This was back when people wore pants with enough room to breathe in, not the tight things they wear now."
They're called skinny jeans, Grandpap,
Graham said with a little tap on his knee. His hand came down and caught hers, and their fingers entwined together. Blythe squeezed Zayden's hand and gave a little nod to the back. His brows scrunched down before he saw their clasped hands. His lips tilted, and he nodded at their hands, like they'd set the example and Grandpap and Graham had followed.
"We had a sweeper salesman show up at our house, and he just wouldn't leave. He managed to get himself to the living room, and he stood there talking like he belonged there. Well, that old rat of Zayden's must have decided that there stood a better hiding place than the one he currently had, and he tore out from under the couch and trucked up that salesman's leg."
Grandpap chuckled.
"You'd have thought his pants were on fire. He tore out of the house, down the walk, and across the street, yipping and slapping at his leg."
Grandpap rubbed his mustache.
"I always kind of felt sorry for that rat. He skedaddled out somewhere between the sidewalk and the corner of the old church where the salesman had parked and took off like he had the devil on his tail."
Probably figured he did.
"Yep. Well, we never saw him again."
The rat or the salesman?
"Both,"
Grandpap chuckled. "I lost my pet."
"You weren't that attached to it."
You're just trying to milk it out for the sympathy,"
Blythe accused, squeezing his hand. He shrugged, busted. "So, Graham, it's your turn. Tell us Blythe's funny story."
"Well," Graham said slyly, "I'll say this. Blythe talks in her sleep."
Blythe gave a self-conscious laugh and nodded.
"That's true. Everyone who slept near me any time has said that at one point or another I've talked in my sleep."
"Lots of people talk in their sleep. You have to do better than that, Graham." Zayden looked out at the long line of traffic. "It looks like we're finally moving."
"Good, I'm hungry,"
Grandpap said.
"Me too," Graham agreed. "But I wasn't finished with my story. There is a certain gentleman's name that Blythe has been saying in her sleep for the last 3 years or so." "What?"
Blythe exclaimed, her eyes big.
"No one has said a word about that to me." "Nope. Lottie told me about it."
Blythe deflated like a tire with a big nail in it.
"Oh."
Lottie had spent more than one night in her bed because of night terrors.
"Now, I don't want to embarrass anyone, but the gentleman you've mentioned, he's here." "Graham!"
Her face had to be fire engine red. She tried to pull her hand away to cup her cheeks, but Zayden wouldn't let go. She thought she saw a smirk on his face, but when he turned to her fully, a pleased grin settled on his lips. "That's a good story," he said. He reached over with his left hand and put the car in drive. Their eyes met. His with a little male pride in them. Hers probably showed her humiliation. She looked away quickly. "We get off the next exit anyway, and I'm going to stop at the first place for gas. Hopefully there's a restaurant around too." He chuckled a little as the line of cars started moving. "I didn't want to say anything, but the gas light came on and I was really hoping we wouldn't be sitting there long." Blythe appreciated the subject change and his normal chatter. It helped her cover up her embarrassment. She had not known that she'd called out his name in her sleep, but she believed it. Not only did she talk in her sleep, but she'd had a few dreams where Zayden had figured prominently, so it stood to reason that she'd have said his name. She just hoped she hadn't said anything else embarrassing. Not in front of Lottie, and nothing that Graham would repeat. Zayden's thumb brushed over the sensitive inside of her wrist. She kept her eyes averted, pretending not to notice and to be extremely interested in the leafless trees that populated the side of the road. They pulled off the exit and into a truck stop restaurant. "Let's eat first, then I'll gas up afterwards." That sounded good to everyone, and they parked close to the restaurant door. Zayden reached across again to put the shifter in park. She still couldn't quite bring herself to meet his gaze. His thumb slid across her palm before she pulled her hand from his and got out. Christmas music played in the background as they perused their menus and ordered. Blythe slouched farther down in her seat as the waitress walked away after taking their orders, and Rockin' Around the Christmas Tree came on. "I think it's a sign, Blythe," Zayden said, standing up with his hand out. He glanced at the two older people. "She promised me a dance." She really hadn't promised, but she took his hand, aware that their true purpose, matchmaking with Grandpap and Gram, was at stake. If they started dancing, chances were that Grandpap and Gram would too. Sure enough, Grandpap said, "Scoot out so I can dance too." He lowered his bushy brows at Gram across the table. "You'll dance with me?" Gram put a hand to her heart and giggled. "Of course." Blythe smiled, following Zayden to a side aisle and placing her hands on his broad shoulders when he turned around. They were hard, solid. Her fingers gripped tighter and there was no give under them. She swallowed against the jumping of her heart. "This place isn't really made for dancing, but at least it's not busy." Zayden put his hands on her waist. Did he feel the shiver that went through her torso? She glanced around, hoping her rioting insides would settle. "Yeah." One of the waitresses, standing with a coworker over by the small salad buffet, smiled and pointed. "I don't think they mind. They actually look like they think it's sweet." "Grandpap and Gram do look sweet together." He nodded over at them. Blythe swiveled her head the other way. Sure enough, Gram and Grandpap were jazzing it up. He took her hand and twirled her around. Gram laughed like a schoolgirl. "Even if they don't fall in love, I think it's safe to say they're having a good time." He snorted. "Worth the sacrifice of dancing with me in the middle of a truck stop diner?" She looked up at him. "It's not a sacrifice." You didn't look super thrilled." He shrugged, muscle and sinew moving under her hand in the most intriguing way. "I'm sorry. I guess I must be thinking about Christmas and all the gifts I have to wrap." "I'm sorry about that." The song ended and a slower song came on. "Please, don't apologize again. It wasn't your fault to begin with, and you've gone out of your way to make it right." She glanced over at Grandpap and Gram. They had moved closer and were slowly swaying to chestnuts roasting on an open fire. Zayden followed her gaze. He looked back at her and lifted his brows, slowly moving closer. His hand slid around her waist. Her fingers wandered over his shoulders and around his back, softly touching the longer, curled ends of his hair. There was no mistaking the shudder that tore through his body. Good or bad? She wasn't sure. Maybe revulsion, since Ken had said he liked men. But the way his eyes darkened and the way his hands cradled her back didn't really seem like revulsion. She bit her lip and turned her head. "Rand seems to like coming to the garage." Zayden's tone was neutral. "Oh, he does. He's so full of stories when he gets home. Not only about the work he's done, but also about the people he's seen and the customers and their cars and problems." Her voice trailed off. She was so happy that Zayden had allowed Rand to help out. Of course, Ken hadn't been happy to hear of it. Zayden's thumb skimmed lightly along her back. Her entire back heated. Her fingers curled behind his neck. His eyes caught hers, and her lungs froze. When had Zayden started looking at her the way a starving man looks at his last meal? She jerked away, knowing she had to be imagining it. Ken had insisted more than once that Zayden was gay. Blythe had never outright asked Zayden about it. After all, it was his own business, and the subject hadn't exactly come up in the casual conversation she'd had with him. But in all the years that she'd been with Ken, she'd never seen Zayden with a girlfriend. He let go and she stumbled back, her hand on the sudden flutter in her stomach. What was wrong with her? She glanced around at the almost empty restaurant, the glittery decorations hanging from the ceiling and the big pictures that were covered in wrapping paper for the season. All the waitresses wore green shirts and red elves' caps. A country Christmas song began pouring from the speakers, complete with violins and guitars. It had to be the season. Christmas was beautiful, magical, and romantic with the right partner. During their early years, Ken and she had spent many enchanted evenings together. Unfortunately, Ken had apparently decided she was replaceable. Sometimes she struggled not to be bitter. "Are you okay?" Zayden asked, his face showing nothing but concern. "Fine," she said, and wanted to mean it. But a streak of loneliness the size of the Mississippi at flood stage had cut through her chest, and she worked to fight it off. "Hey, you two, our food's here," Grandpap said as he led Graham back to their table. They scooted into one side of their booth, rather than facing each other as they had originally, directing the waitress where to place their plates. Blythe didn't even look at Zayden, but slid the whole way to the wall on the opposite side. After all, they were trying to push Graham and Grandpap together. It seemed like it was working, if their sidelong glances and whispering and laughing were any indication. "This is yours," the waitress, Heather, said around chomps of gum. "And this," she gave Zayden an extra big smile, "is yours." She winked. "Thanks," Zayden said, ignoring the obvious flirting. "You folks need anything else?" Heather asked, gathering up her tray and stand. They declined and began to eat. Did Blythe notice his hands shaking? That his spoon clattered against his bowl of beef stew? Zayden wasn't sure, but he could hardly believe she missed it. His whole body tingled from holding her that short amount of time. He understood now why people might say they could have danced all night. With Blythe, all night would feel like mere minutes. But she had backed away as soon as he tried to pull her closer. And he let her go. Of course, like he could have done anything else. It had been hard. His hand had wanted to tighten and pull her even closer, fit her body to his, tuck her head under his chin and allow his hands to glide down her curves. All very dangerous thoughts to be having about his brother's ex-wife. Apparently, she'd known it too, since she had smartly distanced herself from him. No less than what he deserved. His grip tightened on the wheel, like he'd wanted to tighten on her. She'd smiled at him, and his heart couldn't help but want to believe that it was because she liked him. Maybe she did, as a brother. Pulling the car up to the front of the store after filling it up at the gas pump beside the restaurant, he hopped out. He needed to pull himself together before they came out. It was bad enough that the attraction he'd felt for Blythe, that he'd hidden for years, apparently morphed into a full-fledged schoolboy crush. He didn't need to start acting like a schoolboy to top it all off. Hopping out of the car, he let the keys sit on the console. He didn't want to lock it and keep everyone out of it until he used the restroom and bought a water. No one would steal a car that was parked in front of the store. 5 minutes later, he paid for his water and walked out. "I think someone stole our car." Blythe had her bottom lip pulled in between her teeth, and it took all of 2 seconds to rip his eyes away from that side and actually hear what she said. His glance shot up to the stall he'd parked in, right in front, just next to the handicap spot. Empty. His stomach dropped. "Pap said you parked it right here?" she asked, her brows raised hopefully like she thought there was a chance Grandpap was wrong. He nodded slowly, still shocked. "He saw you out the window, but we were in line behind a little boy who was paying with pennies, and it took forever." Graham leaned on her cane. "I offered to give him $2 just to speed it up, but he said his mother told him to use them because she wanted rid of them." Or she wanted a distraction. Although, how would anyone have known that he left the keys in the car and also had enough time to cause a distraction? Zayden blew a breath out. It fogged white in the cold air. The temps had definitely fallen below freezing. 2 cars in 1 day. He'd never heard of a shop losing their state license because of a mix-up like he'd had with Blythe's car. But he wouldn't be getting out of this unscathed, no doubt. "I'd better call the police." He looked around. "Where's Grandpap?" "He said he was going to walk around the building and look in the back." A flake of snow drifted by his nose. For the first time in an hour, he looked up at the sky. Dark, lowering clouds. Snow clouds. There had been no snow in the forecast in Pennsylvania, but I-80 was often the snow-rain line, and they were well above, and going farther north. Was it supposed to snow? He reached in his pocket for his phone. "Not back home," Blythe said, patting her side, then looking around. Zayden's hand dug in his back pocket. His empty back pocket. "I left my phone in the console of the car." Blythe's eyes widened and her hand froze against her side. "I left my purse in the car." Chapter 3. Zayden felt like he'd been knocked down by a boulder. Not only had he lost Blythe's car, but now he'd managed to lose the other car and her purse, plus his phone. He felt his other back pocket. And his wallet. "This is really shaping up to be about the worst Christmas I've ever had." He spun on his heel, touching Graham's elbow. "Come on back in the store with me." He lifted his eyes and looked over Blythe's head, too ashamed to meet her gaze. It had been years, if ever, since he'd been this irresponsible. "I'll need to use their phone, and you might as well wait in here where it's warm." "Hey," Blythe touched his arm. Her eyes were soft, and her head tilted to one side. "It's okay." "You just had your purse stolen. It's 2 days before Christmas. It's not okay." He clenched his fist, wishing he could punch a wall a few times before he had to call and report his car, which was not his car, stolen. That might be an interesting thing to try to explain to the police. Blythe stepped closer. Her sweetly subtle scent drifted past his nose like the slowly falling snow. "It is okay." Her hand came up and touched his cheek, a soft caress that he felt in every pore of his body. "Whether we get our stuff back or not, we're all safe. No one was hurt and we're still together." Her words hung in the air. They were together. Her eyes crinkled. "Now, I think we really need to make that call. The faster we act, the better chance we have of getting the car back." "Hey, boy." Zayden looked over at Grandpap, who was coming around the building. Blythe's hand dropped from his cheek, and the cold seemed more intense. Grandpap, let's go in where it's warm. Why don't we get in the car? Grandpap's face broke out in a grin. You look like you've been poleaxed, boy. The car was stolen. Nah, somebody just took it for a joyride and parked it out back. Zayden narrowed his eyes at Grandpap. Do you have any idea who might have taken it? Nope. All I know is I found it parked behind the building. He gave a slight bow and offered his arm to Graham. Can I escort Milady to her chariot? Graham put her hand to her chest. You're so romantic. She narrowed her eyes at Zayden, then nudged him with her elbow. You've lost her car and her purse. The least you can do is offer her your arm. Zayden gritted his teeth. He wasn't completely convinced. He offered Blythe his arm, then waited for Graham and Grandpap to move ahead of them before leaning over to whisper in Blythe's ear. Did you get the feeling that Grandpap had something to do with the missing car? She looked up, her eyes twinkling. I got the feeling that something fishy was going on. She pursed her lips. Do you suppose they caught on to us playing matchmaker and decided a little revenge was in order? Zayden laughed softly. I hadn't considered that at all. Were we too obvious? I think we were. They're old, not stupid. It backfired for him anyway. More than drawing Graham and Grandpap together, his little play-acting with Blythe had struck a torch to his slow-burning attraction. They do look good together, though, Blythe said as they rounded the corner. Sure enough, the car was pulled into the far back corner of the lot. They do. Zayden held his hand out, calloused palm up. Big, fat flakes fell into his hand, quickly melting into little pools of water. I wonder how much of this white stuff we're supposed to get. I'll look on my phone when we get to the car. Unless Grandpap decided to take that on a joyride too. She snorted. Then, maybe she shouldn't have, but she pulled him to a stop. With a last glance at Grandpap and Graham, who had their backs toward them, she faced Zayden's confused look. I appreciate the fact that you didn't get all upset. I know men who would have thrown a fit just now and would still be angry, taking it out on whomever was near. His lips flattened, but he kept them closed when she held one finger up. Wait, I have more to say. She swallowed. I would kiss you right now, out of gratitude for not ruining our trip, but Ken always said that you preferred men. Whatever, I just want you to know. What? Zayden said incredulously. I prefer men. He shook his head and looked off for a moment before looking back. Like, I'm gay? She could only look at him and nod. The anger that had been so missing just moments ago now colored his face red and caused a vein in his temple to bulge. Her stomach cartwheeled. She should have kept her mouth shut. Zayden couldn't believe his brother could have been so nasty. And why? What good would it have served him to have lied to Blythe? When did Ken say that about me? She scrunched her nose up in that cute way she had, and some of his anger eased. He always did. She shrugged. It's what he always said. Before we started even dating, probably. He was a couple of years younger than Blythe, who was at least 3 years younger than Ken. Had Ken wanted to take out the competition? Not that an 18-year-old would have been appealing to a 21-year-old, especially a 21-year-old who had a doctor interested in her. If you're keeping it a secret, I want you to know I've never told anyone. Anger, like an overheated radiator, steamed up from his lungs. But a new dawning teased the edge of his brain, along with a hope. maybe Blythe had never seemed interested in him because she assumed he wasn't interested in her. Anger had never helped him, ever, in his life, and he pushed it aside now. He stepped closer to Blythe and boldly slid a hand around her neck, under her hair. "Tell me more about this kiss you were going to give me if I weren't gay." She laughed, but it sounded choked.
I was just saying, I appreciate you not being angry."
Her eyes darkened as his head lowered. Her voice became a whisper.
"Sometimes I say dumb things."
He paused, his lips mere inches from hers. Her heart beat like the pistons on a two-stroke against his hand. She trembled. "So you don't want to kiss me?" He meant his question to be a gentle, sweet one, but it came out low and harsh. Her eyes widened. His thumb stroked along her cheek. Her body pressed toward him.
"I do, but you wouldn't enjoy it if you were gay."
He growled. "I'm not gay." His head lowered and he captured her lips with his. Fire leaped up between them like ignition fluid sprayed on a motor. A surprised sound escaped her lips before both hands reached up and grabbed his head, pulling him closer. His entire body shook, and he braced his legs, pulling her closer, tucking her into him. Hot and cold raced down his backbone as her mouth opened under his. He hadn't meant to ravish her mouth in the parking lot, hadn't exactly thought about anything beyond wanting her to know he wasn't what Ken said. Wasn't anything like what Ken said. But once he touched her, tasted her, he stopped thinking completely and only felt, savored, treasured this moment that he finally learned her taste, beauty and grace and raspberries. He'd never tasted such a combination before and couldn't get enough. Relishing the feeling of her tugging on his too long hair before she slid her fingers up into it, caressing his skull, he had a fleeting thought that maybe his hair wasn't too long after all, not if Blythe's fingers could make his toes curl by threading through it. He pulled in his lower stomach. He vaguely heard a cat whistle. Reluctantly, he lifted his head. A cloud of white fog from their frozen breath surrounded their heads as he rested his cheek against hers, her softness against his stubble. How long had he dreamed about this?
"So,"
Blythe's voice came out soft and low.
"Was that a Blythe I'm not gay kiss?"
He smiled against her cheek, knowing immediately what he would say, and not sure how she would react. But it seemed like a good time. His stomach cramped. "No, that was a Blythe, I've wanted to do this forever, and it was even better than I thought it would be, kiss." He allowed the sentence to hang between them, felt the slight stiffening of her body as she absorbed what he was saying, felt her drawing back and tried to stifle the knife of disappointment that cut through him. Her hands dropped from his hair, and she stepped back. He allowed her to go, of course, loosening his hands from around her waist and letting them fall to his sides. He felt empty and more vulnerable than he'd ever felt in his life. After all, he'd just given words to the biggest secret he'd carried for almost 10 years. He was in love with his brother's ex-wife. She tilted her head.
"How long is forever?"
He wasn't backing down now. Only a coward would walk away at this point. "Since I first saw you."
"That was 10 years ago."
He kept his mouth shut and met her gaze steadily.
"You've wanted to kiss me since you first saw me 10 years ago?"
A car horn blared in the distance. Zayden didn't move his head, but Blythe looked. One lip pulled back.
"Grandpap is getting impatient."
"Let him. He's the one who thought it would be funny to hide the car." And Zayden would have to thank him later. He'd finally gotten the kiss he'd been dreaming of. Forget his earlier thoughts of a wretched Christmas. This was the best Christmas ever, even if he did get his gift 2 days early.
So, you're going to answer me?
So, you're going to peel me open, take out all my inside parts and examine them, but what's in here remains a mystery? He touched just below her collarbone lightly with his finger.
What's in there is very confused right now.
A snowflake landed on the tip of her nose. He touched it with his finger before forcing his hand to drop again. That's fair. He nodded his head, looking at the car before his gaze returned to her. He'd still answer her question about how long he'd wanted to kiss her the only way he could, with the truth. He hooked a hand behind his neck before staring into her soft brown eyes, feeling like his very soul was exposed. Yeah, since the first time I saw you. He took a risk, one of many he was taking today, apparently, and grabbed her hand. Come on, you need your car, and if we don't get going soon, Graham's going to have to go back in and use the restroom again. She laughed, leaving her hand in his and following him easily. Good signs, to his way of thinking.
Hi, this is Jay, and thanks for listening. If you're ready for another great audiobook, here's one we think you might like. Or check out the playlist with all our latest releases. Don't forget to subscribe to Say with Jay, give this video a thumbs up, and tell us what you liked in the comments.